Okay, good morning to everyone who is joining us for the start of an amazing week. We are really happy to have you, and I am exceptionally excited to join all of you today. I am Dr. Valencia Walker, and I haven't officially started Nationwide Children's, but I will start on August 1st. This is such a great event, though, that I couldn't wait to get involved. And I'm here today with Dr. Wood, Dr. Chisholm, Dr. Hamid, and Dr. Walton. And we're presenting the racism class. It is now in session. For us to begin, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Ohio State University is a land-grant institution, and as such, it makes it even more important for us to honor the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandotte indigenous peoples as they were the traditional land caretakers of Central Ohio. When we think about their experiences, they absolutely exemplify the broken relationships and the state-sanctioned oppression that we will provide some context to as we go through the first hour of this presentation. The reason why that's important is that we start with a premise, and this is a quote from Assistant Dean Amy Castillo with the Rutgers Business School. She has 25 years as an educator, and as a part of an ongoing qualitative research study, this is a part of a storytelling experience, and this quote really stuck out to all of us as physicians. Trust in doctors is not automatic. When we think about how medicine and education and science overlap, we think of our students. We think that this is a critical lesson that you're going to learn even more about as we go through this hour. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Wood, who will begin to recenter the narrative about race and medicine.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, and good morning to everyone. Hearing an experienced academician and educators state that trust in doctors is not automatic likely incites a range of emotions and reactions from those of us listening, as we are all in academics and medicine. Whether it be confusion, anger, compassion, want for elaboration, or some other response, it would be helpful to stop and investigate the many factors that influence the current state of healthcare, medical education, and medical practice in the United States. Again, to reiterate, for the purpose of this talk, we will be largely focusing on race and its impact on these structures and institutions, beginning with the modern history of medicine. So it really wasn't until the late 1700s that medical practice began to approximate what we know it to be today. Before that time, there was very high morbidity and mortality, largely due to infectious disease and existing sanitation practices or lack thereof, and access to a physician was limited as formal medical education primarily took place outside of the US. There was limited ability to disseminate known information, and the hospital system really did not exist. Royal Hospital was established in 1722 in New Orleans, but was exclusively for the care of French military personnel and those in the King's service. 14 years later, Charity Hospital was founded in New Orleans to tend to the medical care of the poor, followed by Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, which was established in Philadelphia, the fastest growing city in the colonies at that time. Philadelphia was also home to the first American medical school, now known as the University of Pennsylvania, which was followed by Harvard College, King's College, and many, many more. Between the 1800s and 1900s, medical schools began to evolve. The curriculum became graded, and training went from 2 to 3 years in length. Admission requirements became more rigorous, and institutions began to charge admission rather than provide a part-time salary, quite different from the system we know today. It was also during this time that formal research and residency training programs emerged. By the 1920s, many medical schools existed. However, both the public and medical community began to scrutinize and evaluate them more closely due to concerns about safety and quality of training. In the 1940s, federal financial assistance for establishing hospitals, funding training programs, and providing healthcare insurance began. Federal agencies such as the CDC, the National Heart Institute, the National Institutes of Health were founded, and medical specialties also began to emerge. All of these factors, though important, began to create tension and competing interests between the government, the public, and the medical community as medicine clearly began to become an enterprise. And since that time, we've experienced exponential scientific and technological advances. From the 60s to the 80s to the present, as we look back on the emergence of DNA engineering, tissue engineering, microarrays and other lab techniques, imaging techniques, in vitro fertilization, cloning mammalian species, mapping the entire human genome, and creating artificial body parts such as the artificial cornea, which then evolved into creation of human organs using living tissue, and finally the emergence in the last year of 3D printing based on human cells. So as we look back on this 320 years of medical education and innovation, we must be cognizant of the fact that not only were those invited to and allowed into the sciences, academics, and medicine almost exclusively white males, but that subsequently the documentation, dissemination, and perspective of this history is also primarily through the lens of a white male and mostly Eurocentric view. Therefore, this history is incomplete. So what's missing? The history, contributions, and experience of and implications for Indigenous Americans, immigrants and their descendants, Pacific Islanders, women, those in the LGBTQ community, those who are differently abled, and those who are not of the white race. While ethnicity, sex, and nationality are genetic and geographic in nature, other identifying factors I've named, such as race, are social constructs. So understanding why and how they have been created allows us to understand and contextualize the state of medicine today. So what is race? The English word for race was first used in 1580 and was derived from the French race and the Italian razza, which were both first used in 1512. Thousands of years prior, thought leaders such as Plato and Aristotle mused about the origins and relations of all matter and life, which over time evolved into the medieval school of thought known as the Great Chain of Being, which is the diagram that you see on the left. A hierarchical structure rooted in Christianity that begins with God and progressed down to angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals. Though this began to encroach upon race, it did not fully realize or name race or differentiate humans in that physical way. It wasn't until the Enlightenment period between 1650 and the 1780s when classifying and subsequently ranking humans began, as Europeans explored other continents and encountered people that looked differently than themselves. As such, these classifications were based on interpretation of the implications of different physical features. The idea of monogenism, a shared origin of humanity, and polygenism, multiple origins of humanity, were popularized to further distance humans of different ethnicities. Though classification systems and concepts varied, conclusions of those who ranked race universally tended towards white superiority and Black inferiority. At the forefront of this movement were physicians, surgeons, botanists, and other scientists. This includes Francois Bernier, a French physician whose work is actually considered the seed that planted modern prejudice and racism for his very staunch and storied classifications and thoughts. This also includes Carolus Linnaeus, who classified humans into four main groups, including the Americanus, red, choleric, free, the Europeanus, white, sanguine, gentle, acute, inventive, governed by laws, the Asiaticus, yellow, melancholic, covered with loose clothing, ruled by opinions, and the Afro or Africans, black, phlegmatic, lazy, sly, cunning. Other noted authors included Johannes Blumkoch, who utilized craniotomy to differentiate races, and Thomas Huxley, who offered that geography and comparative anatomy were really the ways to classify humans into 5 different races. One of the most vocal and respected American voices in this conversation was that of Thomas Jefferson, who in his publication, Notes on the States of Virginia, utilized race as a justification for the enslavement of African people. He wrote, "They seem to require less sleep. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome, but this may perhaps proceed from want of forethought, which prevents their seeing danger till it be present. They are more ardent after they're female, but love seems to them to be more of an eager desire rather than a tender, delicate mixture of desire and sentiment. In general, their existence seems to participate more of sensation than reflection. Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, to whites, in reason much inferior. In imagination, they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made more distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in endowments of both body and mind. Though there were many leaders, such as Darwin, who rejected these concepts, the shared ideas of non-white races, specifically the Black race being inferior, was widely disseminated and accepted, as most Europeans and many Americans had no direct contact with, exposure to, or experience with people from other ethnicities who lived on other continents. This pseudoscience, now known as scientific racism, became accepted and an actionable fact, and created a hierarchy in which white persons were superior and Black persons were inferior. And writings and journals sharing this messaging are actually still impressed today, despite the absolute lack of any objective scientific fact and rejection by the anthropology community. Scientific racism was then utilized as a justification for the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples, which is one of the most clear, devastating, and historically impactful, yet ever relevant examples. So as we revisit our medical timeline, it looks and feels a little different, a bit uncomfortable, as we considered who had access to and benefit from scientific discovery, medical education, and medical care. But to be inclusive, we must also consider the plight of those from all groups and ethnicities. This includes the Indigenous Americans, who, as Dr. Walker pointed out, their land was stolen and colonized, their history and traditions burned, pillaged, and destroyed, and the subsequent government sanctioned mistreatment that they have suffered since the arrival of the first Europeans is ever prevalent today. We must also consider the plight of women in ongoing attempts to achieve equality, from suffrage to inequities in employment and wages to reproductive rights. We must also consider the journey of immigrants and their descendants, beginning with laws and acts that were intentionally enacted in order to prohibit their presence and inhibit their access to equal opportunity. And finally, we must consider the experience of the LGBTQIA+ community and the violence, mistreatment, and restriction of civil liberties which continue to plague their community as well. As academics in the medical field, we should strive to always consider the historical context and perspective of our peers, our students, our mentors, our patients, especially those who navigate life identifying with multiple of these marginalized groups. As we move through the next speakers in this series, you will understand why. When we think about learners and we think about learning in the context of this history, we have to remember that it was only 56 years ago that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or natural origin, prohibiting unequal racial segregation in schools, employment, public accommodations, and voting rights. Prior to 1964, systemic racism allowed Black students to be legally denied entrance into college and medical school, necessitating the founding of historically Black colleges and universities, known as HBCUs, which took place between 1837 and 1962 in order to train both skilled workers and the next generation of educators. Today, there are 107 HBCUs with over 228,000 students. 56 institutions are private and 51 are public. This includes 3 HBCUs with medical training programs: Howard University in Washington, D.C., Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and Morehouse College of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. And despite the integration of learning and processes and progress that has taken place over these last 56 years, Meharry and Howard still graduate over 80% of Black doctors and dentists in practice today, which, though a testament to their excellence and proven efficacy in creating well-trained, exceptional physicians, still shows that they are needed in order for Black students to matriculate to and through medicine. So as we consider the medical and scientific discovery to which we have dedicated our training, our time, our lives, we have to be cognizant that the recognition of differences among humans, the creation of race, then bred scientific racism, which fed and supported systemic racism, which still impacts us today. I will now turn it over to Dr. Walker, who will walk us through and help us further understand the implications of this evolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much for allowing us to really take a moment to center where all of this begins from a historical perspective. But where does it take us to? Going back to some of those narratives and storytelling that we discussed, I want to share this quote and take the time to read it explicitly to you. This is from a 7th, 8th grade science teacher who's been an educator for almost 20 years. Race, along with socioeconomics, impacts the experience when you realize there's a difference between what you have and what neighboring towns have. We can start with the facilities. Do many urban schools look welcoming, updated, and clean? Mine does not. So what does that say to the students? I believe it tells them that they don't matter as much. That's a part of what racism does. It is as simultaneously callous, insidious, and always pervasive. Dr. Wood did a beautiful job of setting up the ideology of how we created this social construct and overlaid scientific reason and rationale and publications and research. But we have to go beyond the ideological to understand that the purpose was to make people less than, to dehumanize them. But how do you continue to do that when that history was hundreds of years ago? Well, then you start to embed it into situations and to cultural beliefs. We can start with just something like stereotypes. Maybe there's some truth to it, but it becomes overgeneralized. If we look at it from a fun perspective or how to make a movie that's interesting, there's an old movie from 1994, White Men Can't Jump, where you had Woody Harrelson as an actor, a very young Woody Harrelson. And they were able to hustle people because no one thought the white guy could play basketball. But then what makes stereotypes different from prejudice is that you're not even basing your negative prejudice on any reason or actual experience. So it's as simple as someone saying, I'm not going to be friends with Southerners because they're so horrible. As someone who grew up in the South, I'm going to advise you against that prejudice. But what it really matters is when you put prejudice and power together. I can be an African-American person and have a race-based prejudice against some other race. But as an African-American in the current construct that we live under in this society, I can't take my prejudice and combine it with state-sanctioned institutionalized power in order to specifically create structural and systemic racism. I'm not allowed to take action that will allow me to prevail in discriminating and oppressing other groups of people. So one example of discrimination, we are celebrating 1 year of the Crown Act, where this is legislation that needed to be specifically enacted so that many of us who want to wear the hair that grows out of our head, the way that it grows out of our head, are not denied jobs, denied promotions, or treated differently just because of who we authentically are. Beyond the definitions, we're starting to get into how the prejudice leads to discrimination that leads to the structural and systemic components that become institutionalized in our society. This also goes back over time. After the Civil War and after Reconstruction, you had laws and legal systems that were set up explicitly to disenfranchise African Americans and then subsequently other immigrants and other minorities in this country. African Americans, indigenous people couldn't vote, they couldn't testify against white people. There were laws that were created specifically to penalize them and create reasons to criminalize and put people in jail. There was policing that was done that grew out of militia of state slave patrols. Then we think about education. So the picture on the left, actress Felicity Huffman, you may be familiar with the scandal that happened with college admissions. She was punished under the legal system for trying to pursue a better education for her child. It was 14 days in jail, a $30,000 fine, and community service. On the right, there's a picture of Tanya McDowell. She, on the other hand, in a different state with different rules, as an unsheltered person who used her babysitter's address to get her child into school, she was sentenced to 5 years in jail. This is what structural and systemic racism looks like when you create laws that disproportionately harm people of color. How this particularly shows up is in our housing. So even here in Ohio, there were things such as covenant laws, and this is language that I've specifically pulled out of a common covenant phrasing. No persons of any race other than Caucasian shall use or occupy any premises or any part of, except that this provision shall not prevent occurring domestic servants of a different race to be domiciled with an owner or tenant. Basically saying as a Black person, you could work as a servant, but you could never own that property. Interestingly enough, Ohio in 2017 decided that they didn't have the jurisdiction to strike this offensive language out of these codes. So it still exists, even though, of course, as Dr. Wood mentioned, we have the Fair Housing Act that doesn't allow you to discriminate. But where does housing even get into education and to medicine? So many of you may have heard recent discussions about the 99th anniversary of the massacre that happened in Tulsa, the burning of Black Wall Street. There was also Seneca Village, which used to stand on some of the most expensive real estate in the world, Central Park, where African Americans owned property and were forced out so that wealthy people could take over this prime luxury and continue to generate years and years of wealth and equity for themselves and for their family. So what does this look like? And this is, I apologize, my splicing didn't work well. So give me a second to go back and just go forward where we need to go to watch the pertinent segment of this video.
Segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases.
So here we start to understand how segregation, how institutionalized policies affected your ability to attain education, affected the neighborhoods that you could grow into, and affected how you were able to create a legacy of wealth for those that came after you. Beyond segregating people into neighborhoods, we began to separate people into communities, and so that they no longer came into contact with each other in a meaningful way. And people started to think that, oh, my neighborhood is a great neighborhood because we built it to be that way, and they just didn't work hard enough, or they just didn't take the opportunities that we did. And so then it began to justify what we typically think of and talk about when it comes to racism, which are the interpersonal aspects. So this is where we get into the personal mistreatment, the name calling, the both conscious and unconscious actions. We see the powerful imagery that is carried through the years of state-sanctioned terrorization. Lynching affected not only African Americans, but those for our Latinx community and those of other nationalities and ethnicities as well when you look throughout the United States. We are still waiting to this day for our anti-lynching bill to pass. Beyond the obvious terror that many of our parents and grandparents may have experienced, there was also the idea of patriotism being seen as exclusive to those that were white and were wealthy and were landowners. And even recently, there are discussions about how far-right extremists have infiltrated into some of our policing practices and different policing stations throughout the country. We also know that some of these same symbols of terror still show up today. And so it no longer has to become about the actual violence, but the threat of violence and the history of what it represents to continue to perpetuate this hate and to uphold the system of othering that perpetuates racism. Often people will say that if you have racism, then you can have reverse racism. I want to be very clear here and let you know that that is absolutely a false equivalency. As I said earlier, you can have a race-based prejudice, but without prejudice and power, when we talk about structural and systemic racism, there's no such thing as a reverse. Think of it as gravity. You have gravity or you have the absence of gravity. You don't reverse gravity. So to be very clear, the ideological, the institutional continues to create the perpetuation of interpersonal. But perhaps what we struggle with the most and what's most difficult to capture in such a short amount of time with you is what happens when this structural and systemic racism becomes internalized and all the different ways that this can be internalized. From an acceptance of inferiority by those who are oppressed, by an acceptance and an assumption of superiority by those who have the systemic power to influence discrimination through their prejudice. And we see it even in the reenactment of the Clark doll experiments that were fundamental to the Brown versus Board of Education. So this is a more recent redo of the Clark doll experiments.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
talk about this a little bit more about how children start to have racial awareness and how this racial awareness is a part of the society and the culture that generates all the other things that we've already discussed. So when people talk about why people react the way they do in their neighborhoods and their environments, we also have to understand concepts such as horizontal violence. And it's this idea that you have to find a way of just managing that sense of powerlessness or despair. We're talking about it now in a different way when we talk about deaths of despair from those of whites who are of lower socioeconomic status, and how we see that their life expectancy is shorter now for a variety of reasons, some of which is related to increase with our opioid epidemic, but there are a lot of other reasons. But again, it's this idea that when you internalize how structural and systemic racism works, it plays out not just mentally, but it plays out emotionally, and it plays out in our physical health as well. So that takes us back to where we started. Trust in doctors is not automatic. But how do we get back there again? We've seen how racism in science was used to justify structural racism, how racism in medicine is complicit with some of the things that we see today. But where does it show up for us in our day-to-day? Many of you have probably heard about the Tuskegee experiment. It's often quoted as an example of why African Americans have a mistrust in the system. But many of you may not know the full name. The full name of this was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. This was a government-approved, state-sanctioned, government-funded research study to look at how syphilis progressed over time. The study started in 1932. 15 years later, by 1947, we had penicillin. We knew that it was a cure for syphilis, but yet the Tuskegee study continued until 1972, 1973. Do you know what else happened in 1947? There were the Nuremberg Codes that were very specific based off what had happened with Nazi experimentation on Jews, on the idea of consent and properly informed consent. And this was something that was denied to the African Americans who participated in that study for several more decades. But yet this is only one example of mistrust, of how African Americans and other minorities have been exploited for the purpose of science. This leads into mistreatment, where even in 2016, there was a study of medical students and residents that still professed to feeling that African Americans had thicker skin, that they felt pain differently. We also see it in how people follow clinical guidelines. So this picture is taken from a paper. The paper is about now 20 years old, but they had actors who went through the same script of complaints and symptoms, and even though they had the same words, what happened was those that were women and African American were less likely to be referred for cardiac catheterization. I've already mentioned how African Americans are often viewed differently in terms of how they experience pain, and in particular, this can have a significant effect on our patients that have sickle cell. As well, we know that end-of-life care disparities exist for African Americans. And it's as simple as how much time the team spends with a patient of color as compared to other patients when it times comes to have those end-of-life discussions. Beyond that, there are microaggressions that happen to patients, microaggressions that are experienced by you as students, as faculty, and as staff. Some examples are this idea that we can interpret African American vernacular. Or even though wearing your white coat and your badge that clearly says physician, you're still not recognized as the healthcare professional. Just to share a personal story, maybe too personal for the first time you meeting me, but I was out one evening as a resident many years ago, and I was approached by a gentleman who was asking me questions and wanted to get to know me better. And he's like, "Oh, so where do you work?" "I work at a hospital." Oh, are you a nurse? No. Are you a secretary? No. Do you work in the cafeteria? No. Well, what do you do? And it really struck me that there was nothing about our conversation that he could even fathom that I might be a physician. And so I said, I do customer service. And he was like, oh, so you answer phones. Now, needless to say, that's where the story ends. And maybe this is more of a humorous example, but we know the sting of the invalidations and the assaults and the microaggressions that often turn into macroaggressions and racial abuse. And this is something that we have to process and navigate, and it takes a toll on our patients and it takes a toll on us. So you have the mistrust, you have the mistreatment, you have the microaggressions, and all of this continues to fuel the racism that leads to disparities in health outcomes. So beyond that, we see these worse outcomes. As a neonatologist, I look at the infant mortality rates in Ohio, looking over more than almost 10 years. Despite interventions, there's still a persistent gap in African American infants dying at more than 2 times, sometimes almost 3 times the rate of white infants. If we look beyond mortality, even just preterm birth, which we know puts people at risk for health complications throughout the rest of their life. When you look at a really interesting sociological study, they looked at counties that had evidence of increased implicit and or explicit prejudice. And they found that for African Americans living in those counties across the United States, they could see a difference in the preterm births, and they were able to really dig into this deeper and not just go by socioeconomic status or education, but really look at how the experience of discrimination and prejudice and racism fundamentally changes our health outcomes and the health outcomes of our offspring, which as we think about developmental origins of disease, we know changes our health for generations to come. So where does that take us? We started with this creation justified by science and medicine of taking differences and creating racism and then embedding it and institutionalizing it into every aspect of our society. One last video before we get to take a break. We're not going to play a video. I apologize. It doesn't seem like the video wants to play. I'll try one more time.
Surrounded by
That might qualify as a technical difficulty. So I'll stop there for some technical difficulties. I think the point of this is to point out that over time, we've created systems that have perpetuated racism, that have institutionalized it, and have segregated people into communities that affect their ability to generate wealth, that affect their ability to access education, and altogether leads to the conversations we have about social determinants of health and the disparities and inequities that we see in health outcomes. So I want to thank you for your patience and thank you for your understanding with the technical difficulties. We'll take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll come back for the second part of our class in session. Thank you.